You think you know how power works. Think again. What if a man the world dismissed with a glance held a secret that could collapse an entire financial empire? In just one day, Malcolm Reed turned silent humiliation into a quiet revolution. This story isn't just about money. It's about dignity, resilience, and a reckoning that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The towering glass facade of Hamilton Financial's flagship branch gleamed under the early sun, its perfect symmetry a cold testament to the illusion of inclusion. Inside, the scent of polished leather and sanitized air wafted through the marble lobby, where whispers echoed against high ceilings like the hush of secrets too dangerous to speak. The building thrummed with an unspoken hierarchy, each movement choreographed executives gliding through glass partitions, receptionists rehearsing their impeccable smiles, security guards stationed with the kind of stillness that whispered, "You do not belong." Into this calculated stillness stepped a man, not with the flash of wealth or the armor of entourage, but with quiet resolve that drew attention precisely because he did not seek it. His name was Malcolm Reed, a name that would soon reverberate through boardrooms and back alleys alike, though today it passed unacknowledged. He wore a tailored navy suit, modest but crisp, with a tie loosened just enough to hint at comfort, but not carelessness. His gait was measured, his posture unyielding, his eyes scanning the space with the calm of someone who had walked into rooms where he was not wanted and left them changed. As Malcolm crossed the lobby, he felt eyes flicker toward him, the quick scan from the concierge, the subtle glance from a passing associate, the almost imperceptible tightening of a security guard's jaw. His skin was the wrong shade for the marble glow of this space, his presence too calm to be ignored. He carried no briefcase, only a slim portfolio tucked under one arm, its contents ordinary to the untrained eye, but devastating in their implication. Each step was deliberate, yet unhurried, as if he were not walking into a trap, but setting one. He approached the main reception desk, where a young woman named Claire, her badge glinting in the light, offered a smile that was polished, but empty. "Can I help you, sir?" She asked, her tone a careful balance of professionalism and preemptive dismissal. Before he could answer, a heavy-set man in a gray suit, security manager Colin Baird, approached from the side. His hand rested on his hip, not on a weapon, but on the authority it implied. "Excuse me, Sir Baird," said smoothly, stepping between Malcolm and the desk. "May I ask the nature of your business today?" Malcolm's lips twitched in a faint smile, one that never reached his eyes. "I have a meeting with Mr. Stanton." Baird's expression flickered momentary recognition, then skepticism. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. Do you have an appointment confirmation?" Malcolm produced his phone, scrolling deliberately to the email, and held it out. The screen displayed a clear appointment with Jonathan Stanton, Director of Institutional Client Services, scheduled for 9 Surge OIM today. Claire glanced at the screen, her smile faltering. Baird didn't move. His voice dropped just a shade more assertive. Mr. Stanton's schedule is quite full. Let me check with his office. In the meantime, I'll need you to wait over there." He gestured toward a small seating area near the public ATMs, a deliberate positioning designed to segregate. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. He returned his phone to his pocket, inclined his head slightly, and stepped aside, but not to the designated area. Instead, he positioned himself near the glass wall separating the lobby from the executive elevator bank. His reflection mirrored back at him, a man in control, a man invisible to those who believed they controlled the narrative. Minutes passed. Claire whispered into a headset, her voice low and urgent. Baird hovered nearby, his stance casual but eyes sharp. Malcolm remained still, a quiet sentinel in a space designed to unsee him. Behind the glass, executives passed by, some glancing out, their expressions tightening when they noticed the still figure standing alone. The air thickened with unspoken tension. Malcolm's phone buzzed softly, an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, then answered. His voice was low, but distinct. "Yes, I'm here." "No, they haven't called me in yet." "Yes, I'll wait." The call ended. The message was sent. A murmur rippled through the lobby as Baird returned, this time accompanied by another guard. His voice was louder now, authoritative. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The words hung in the air like a blade descending. Malcolm's smile faded. His voice, when it came, was steady, measured, but carried a weight that reverberated against the marble and glass. "I believe you're mistaken. I'm a client here, and I have a confirmed meeting." Baird's face flushed, but his response was immediate, clipped. "I'm asking you to leave. Now." The quiet became suffocating. Eyes turned, whispers began to ripple. Malcolm's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained calm. He drew a breath, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Then, without protest, he gathered his portfolio, straightened his shoulders, and turned toward the door. He did not rush. His pace remained deliberate, each step echoing against the marble with the weight of dignity denied but not destroyed. Outside, the city bustled, oblivious. But inside, something invisible cracked. Those who watched would later say they didn't know, couldn't have known what his departure signified. That it was just another misunderstanding, another man turned away. But by the time the sun dipped beneath the skyline that evening, the name Malcolm Reed would no longer be whispered behind cupped hands. It would roar through news cycles, boardrooms, and regulatory offices, alike shaking foundations built on unchallenged power. And it all began with a quiet entrance, a silent challenge, and a dignity that refused to be erased. The hum of conversation, the click of polished shoes on marble, the low rustle of papers, all fell into a brittle, biting silence as Malcolm Reed stood motionless, his heart thrumming a slow, deliberate beat. The security guards flanking him moved with the precision of men who had played this scene before, but their practiced air could not conceal the ugliness of what unfolded. Baird, the heavy-set security manager, pressed a hand to Malcolm's arm, not forceful enough to bruise, but firm enough to leave a message. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time. This way, please." Baird said, his voice loud enough to turn heads in the lobby. There was no misunderstanding now. Malcolm, a man who had come not as a supplicant, but as an invited guest, was being herded out like an intruder. His meeting with Jonathan Stanton, a meeting that could have cemented a pivotal partnership, had been reduced to a humiliating charade staged for the benefit of those who would never see him as more than a question mark out of place. As Baird and his colleague guided him toward the exit, the quiet observation of the staff sharpened into whispered speculation. One junior banker leaned into her colleague, murmuring, "What did he do?" A concierge, glancing at the security commotion, muttered, "That's why we have protocols." The air once filled with the sterile scent of wealth and power now carried the stench of exclusion dressed as procedure. Malcolm's mind traced the surreal rhythm of it all, the glances, the dismissals, the unspoken calculations behind each decision. His pulse raced, but his face remained calm. Every fiber of his being fought against the instinct to react, to demand explanation, to challenge the humiliation. But he knew. He had known from the moment Baird's tone shifted, from the moment his presence became an anomaly rather than an appointment. At the glass doors, the world outside glittered the city's heartbeat, oblivious to the quiet implosion of dignity within. Baird gave a final shove, not violent, but final, and the door clicked shut behind Malcolm. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightening against the rising flood of fury and helplessness. The air outside was sharp, biting against his skin, a contrast to the manufactured calm he had left behind. For a moment, Malcolm stood still, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He ignored it, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt the weight of every insult, every snub, every microaggression he had endured, compressed into this singular act of exclusion. Yet even as humiliation threatened to overwhelm him, a deeper resolve coiled beneath his calm exterior. He knew the cost of rage. He knew the peril of reacting in a system built to misinterpret his dignity as defiance. So he inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with cold air that burned like truth, and exhaled slowly, releasing the tightness in his chest. This was not the end of the story. This was not the conclusion the institution thought it had written. Inside the lobby, returned to its curated calm. Baird adjusted his jacket, smirked at a colleague, and shrugged as if brushing off an inconvenience. Claire returned to her desk, her smile flickering back into place as she greeted the next client, a woman in designer heels, her voice light and easy. The building resumed its rhythm, as if the rupture of dignity moments earlier had been a mere ripple on its polished surface. But the ripples were spreading. Malcolm's departure had not gone unnoticed by everyone. A junior compliance officer, observing from behind a glass partition, made a silent note in his digital log. A maintenance worker, who had seen the entire exchange, stared at the floor for a long moment before returning to his duties with a bitterness that clung to him like dust. And beyond the lobby, a network of connections Malcolm had nurtured for years was already moving into quiet motion. He stepped away from the glass facade, his movements deliberate and composed. A black sedan, waiting at the curb, glided forward at his signal. The driver, a quiet man with an air of practiced discretion, opened the door. Malcolm slid into the seat without a word, the door closing with a soft, decisive click. As the car merged into the city's flow, he finally allowed himself a glance back at the building, a monolith of wealth and arrogance now blind to the reckoning it had triggered. In the quiet hum of the sedan, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time he answered his voice, low-controlled. "It's done," he said. "They've made their decision." A pause, then prepare the files. Full withdrawal, no delays. The voice on the other end acknowledged, with a crisp affirmation. As Malcolm disconnected, a quiet sense of purpose settled over him. He stared out the window at the city streaming by, the streets alive with the ordinary flow of lives, untouched by the silent drama that had unfolded that morning. Inside his mind, Malcolm was already outlining the next steps, the calls to be made, the documents to be finalized, the meetings to be canceled. The insult had been public, the exclusion deliberate. But his response would be strategic, precise, and devastating in its implications. The $3.6 billion his firm controlled was not just capital, it was leverage. And as the institution he'd just left would soon learn, leverage, wielded by a man dismissed, was a force more potent than any boardroom decree. Malcolm Reed, stripped of dignity, but unbowed, was about to turn the machinery of exclusion against itself, not with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet, unstoppable precision of a reckoning long overdue. The sun had long begun its slow descent beyond the skyline of Chicago, painting the high-rises in hues of burnt gold and deep amber. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled conference room of Reed Financial's headquarters, tucked unassumingly into a downtown high-rise, its exterior marked only by a discreet brass plaque, Malcolm Reed sat surrounded by his inner circle. The day's quiet humiliation at Langston Bancorp lingered like a sour taste, but it was not the kind of defeat that left a man broken. Instead, it was the fuel for a response meticulously prepared for years. The walls of the conference room bore no ostentation, just a sleek series of digital monitors that now flickered with graphs, contract terms, and withdrawal protocols. Malcolm sat at the head of the table, his usual unassuming charcoal suit, now a symbol of the quiet authority he had always carried. His legal counsel, Clara Mendez, and his compliance director, Evan Singh, leaned in their expressions grave but resolved. "It's not just about the funds," Malcolm said, his voice low, each word carefully measured. "It's about the message, about reminding them and the world that silence is not consent. That exclusion has consequences." Evan tapped on his tablet, bringing up a live feed summary of the automated withdrawal orders already cascading through Langston Bancorp's core systems. The $3.6 billion is being disbursed into secured verified accounts. Offshore contingencies are ready. Media leaks are controlled. Within the hour, their liquidity will be compromised. Clara's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. "Their compliance department won't see this coming. We followed every clause, every stipulation. They underestimated you because they thought you'd be too humiliated to fight back." Malcolm's eyes didn't flicker. They thought wrong. He leaned back, exhaling a slow, deliberate breath. His mind's eye replayed the scenes from earlier that day, the bank's polished lobby, the feigned civility melting into overt disdain, the calculated removal. And now, those same players, smirking executives, complicit staff, would be scrambling to make sense of a financial tsunami they could neither control nor contain. "Get me Brixton Media," he said, his tone brokering no delay. Within minutes, the call was established, patched through to the head of a powerful media group that had for years operated quietly in the background of Reed Financial's vast network. A woman's voice, clipped and precise, filled the speaker. "Mr. Reed," she greeted, "I see the withdrawal orders. Shall we initiate the public release?" Malcolm paused, then nodded, though she couldn't see. "Yes. Controlled release to key outlets. No embellishments. Just facts. Make sure Langston Bancorp's handling of today's events is documented, every slight, every systemic dismissal." It's time the narrative reflected the truth. As the call disconnected, Malcolm's team worked swiftly, disseminating carefully prepared statements, secured evidence, and timelines to pre-briefed journalists. The story would hit headlines not as a dramatic expose, but as a calm, factual dismantling of an institution's facade. The media spin Langston Bancorp might attempt would already be too late. By the time they realized the storm was upon them, the public record would be set. Outside the conference room windows, dusk settled over the city, but inside the air hummed with purpose. Every member of Malcolm's team understood that this wasn't just business. It was about restoring dignity and resetting expectations. About showing the power that comes not from loud declarations, but from quiet, unyielding resilience backed by irrefutable facts. Evan glanced up from his terminal. Langston's emergency board meeting is scheduled for 8:00 p.m. They'll try to contain this, but they won't have time. We've triggered immediate audits across their major accounts. Clara added her voice steady, and the Department of Financial Equity has been alerted to the compliance breaches. They'll have regulators knocking before Langston can draft an internal memo. Malcolm's face remained composed, but beneath that surface, a quiet fire burned. He had always known that being underestimated could be turned into a weapon. They had focused on his appearance, his unassuming demeanor, and his silence in the face of insult. They had never looked past the surface to see the intricate network of influence preparation and authority he wielded. This wasn't revenge, it was accountability, and it was executed with the precision of a man who had spent decades building alliances, securing leverage, and positioning himself where no public slight could erase his impact. Across town in Langston's gleaming tower, the first alerts began to cascade through the systems. Transaction holds freezing of high-value accounts, cascading liquidity drains. The executives, initially puzzled, began to sense the enormity of the unfolding crisis. Phones rang, unanswered emergency meetings were called, and faces once smug turned ashen with realization. The name Reed Financial, once dismissed as peripheral, flashed across internal screens in connection with every critical account now locked down. Jonathan Stanton Langston's CEO stormed into the crisis suite demanding answers. His staff stammered about regulatory triggers, external withdrawal requests, and pending media statements. But it was too late. The damage was done. Malcolm, seated calmly in his conference room, knew they would scramble, that some would try to salvage reputations, others to shift blame. But none of that mattered. The facts were set, the damage irreversible. He had no need to gloat. His satisfaction was not in their downfall, but in the quiet assertion of dignity, the kind that could not be ignored, spun, or denied. Clara's voice cut through the murmured updates. They're calling it Langston's midnight crisis already. Malcolm allowed a faint smile, not of triumph, but of quiet resolve. Let them call it what they will, he said. By morning, they'll understand it wasn't a crisis. It was a reckoning. And as the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, the quiet power that had always been hidden behind Malcolm's silence and unassuming presence finally stood in full view. It was not loud, not theatrical, but it was undeniable. By the time dawn cracked over Chicago's spired skyline, Langston Bancorp was no longer the towering monolith it had once appeared. The polished glass and marble that had once gleamed like a badge of unshakable authority now seemed to reflect a different story, one of desperation, of crumbling facades, hastily patched with empty reassurances. Inside the boardroom on the top floor, the air was thick with panic and disbelief. Papers littered the long table where executives sat, slumped, their designer suits creased with fatigue. Their ties loosened, their voices hoarse from hours of damage control. Malcolm Reed's withdrawal had been the first domino, but it was the precision of his follow-through that had brought the entire edifice to its knees. As the federal regulators arrived just before sunrise, a quiet hush overtook the usually bustling halls of the headquarters. The news had traveled faster than the executives' attempts to conceal it. Langston Bancorp's multi-billion-dollar accounts with Reed Financial, the ones they had taken for granted, were gone. The internal compliance breaches had been flagged, their discriminatory practices laid bare by Malcolm's team, and the media, armed with meticulously compiled documentation, had seized the narrative. In the quiet of his own home, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table sipping a cup of black coffee while reading the headlines on his tablet. Langston Bancorp faces unprecedented crisis. Amid discrimination allegations, one read. Another simply stated, Reed Financial pulls $3.6 billion sparks market turmoil. He scrolled slowly, absorbing the commentary, the expert analyses, the condemnations. He felt no vindication, no smugness, just a profound sense of rightness, of clarity, that justice had found a way to speak not through shouting, but through methodical, undeniable truth. Back at Langston's headquarters, CEO Jonathan Stanton paced the floor, his movements erratic, his face pallid beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. His phone buzzed incessantly each call, bringing a fresh wave of bad news: clients pulling accounts, institutional investors freezing transactions, compliance officers resigning under the weight of impending inquiries. His control was slipping, and he knew it. His once ironclad reputation was now a whisper of disgrace echoing down the hallways. His advisors murmured behind closed doors, their confidence in him eroding with every new alert that flashed across their screens. In the cafeteria, which was now eerily deserted, save for a few shell-shocked employees, a junior compliance officer named Riley Jones sat clutching her phone, reading the same headlines Malcolm had scanned hours earlier. She had overheard whispers the previous afternoon about the black client incident, but it was only now, with the news splashed across every screen, that she understood the gravity of what had transpired. Her heart ached, not just for the institution crumbling around her, but for the realization that her silence, her complicity in a culture of quiet prejudice, had made her part of the story. She wondered if Malcolm had noticed her that day, if he'd seen her hesitation, her brief moment of doubt, and judged her among the guilty. On the trading floor, the few remaining brokers were glued to their monitors, watching as Langston Bancorp's stock price plummeted with each passing minute. The market had reacted swiftly, punishing the bank not only for its financial instability, but for the moral failing at its core. One broker, a man named Darren, turned to his colleague and muttered under his breath, "It's not just the money, it's the culture." This was bound to happen sooner or later. His words were met with a nod, a shared recognition of a truth long denied, but now glaringly evident. In the midst of the collapse, Stanton finally convened what was meant to be a last-ditch effort at salvage a video call with the remaining major stakeholders. But the mood on the screen was grim. Faces appeared, some visibly angry, others cold and calculating. Questions were hurled. Why weren't we informed earlier? How could this happen? What's the plan to rebuild? Stanton's answers, once smooth and practiced, now stumbled. His assurances rang hollow, his explanations threadbare. One by one, stakeholders either muted their screens or left the call entirely, their silence speaking volumes. Meanwhile, Malcolm's office at Reed Financial was serene. Clara Mendez was overseeing a team of analysts who were managing the smooth transition of assets from Langston Bancorp to secure financial institutions that had passed Reed's rigorous ethical standards. Evan Singh was coordinating with legal teams to finalize the last compliance reports that would be submitted to regulators. It was not just about dismantling Langston's operations. It was about setting a precedent, about signaling to the industry that the era of unchecked discrimination under the guise of corporate prestige was over. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the debris of Langston's crumbling reputation, Malcolm stood by the window of his office watching the city stir to life. He thought of the faces he had seen at the bank, the security guard who had shoved him, the receptionist who had dismissed him, the executives who had smirked as they orchestrated his removal. He thought of how none of them had imagined he would possess the quiet authority, the intricate network of power, to bring their empire to its knees. They had mistaken his composure for submission, his silence for weakness. And now, as their carefully constructed facade fell in slow motion, Malcolm felt a quiet, unshakable resolve settle in his chest. Downstairs, Reed Financial's lobby was beginning to fill with clients, some familiar faces, others new, drawn by the quiet integrity of the man whose name now carried not just weight, but principle. A woman in a tailored blue dress approached the front desk and asked to open a new account. When the receptionist offered her the necessary forms, she paused and said softly, "It's not just the service I'm here because of what your company stands for." By late afternoon, Langston Bancorp's board of directors had convened one final desperate session. Legal counsel presented options, none of them palatable. The words restructuring government intervention and class action liabilities filled the room like the tolling of a funeral bell. Stanton sat motionless at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly, the weight of irreversible failure pressing down on his shoulders. Across the screen of his tablet, a notification blinked. Langston Bancorp stock trading halted, pending further investigation. Malcolm, back in his office, closed his laptop with a soft click. He glanced at Clara and Evan, his expression calm but resolute. "It's done," he said quietly. But they all understood that it wasn't merely an ending. It was a beginning. A new chapter, not just for Reed Financial, but for every individual and institution that had ever believed power could be used to silence, to exclude, to diminish. Outside, the city continued its steady pulse. The headlines would soon shift. The market would stabilize, but the story would linger, etched into the fabric of an industry forced to confront its own reflection. And as the final emails were sent, the last funds secured, and the last calls from Langston went unanswered, Malcolm Reed stood not as a man vindicated by revenge, but as a quiet force whose dignity, patience, and unyielding commitment to justice had rewritten the rules of the game. In the weeks following Langston Bancorp's spectacular fall, the city's skyline glittered no less brightly. But for Malcolm Reed, the light no longer carried the same sterile gleam of false promises and hidden cruelties. Instead, it shimmered with the quiet possibility of change. From the confines of his office at Reed Financial, he watched as the last traces of Langston's influence were erased from market tickers and business headlines. But Malcolm's mind was not on revenge, nor on the temporary satisfaction of victory. His thoughts turned instead to the work that needed to follow, the hard, quiet work of building something enduring in the hollow left by Langston's collapse. He knew the headlines would fade, that public memory was fickle, that outrage would cool into resignation unless it was replaced by action. And so as his team finalized the last transfers and compliance reports, Malcolm began outlining a new initiative. Not one, aimed at profiting from Langston's downfall, but one designed to plant the seeds of a more inclusive financial future. He envisioned partnerships with community banks in underserved neighborhoods, mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs of color, and educational workshops that would demystify financial systems too often wielded as barriers rather than tools of empowerment. At Reed, financial meetings took on a new tone. Clara Mendez and Evan Singh collaborated on outreach strategies, ensuring that the new programs weren't just reactive gestures, but thoughtfully crafted frameworks that would last. They reached out to local leaders in neighborhoods like Bronzeville and Inglewood, inviting them not merely to participate, but to lead. Malcolm insisted on transparency, on partnerships that centered the voices too often silenced in boardrooms, on policies shaped by lived experience rather than abstract projections. In one particularly poignant moment, Malcolm met with a group of young, Black entrepreneurs in a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a co-working space. He listened as they shared their frustrations about doors that remained closed, about opportunities passed over, about the weight of systemic obstacles that no amount of personal excellence seemed able to lift. He didn't interrupt with promises or platitudes. Instead, he took notes. He asked questions, and at the end, he simply said, "We're here to change that, not by giving you a seat at our table, but by building a new table together." It was not a grand gesture, but it was one that resonated. News of Reed Financial's approach began to ripple through business circles, not as scandal or spectacle, but as a model of what leadership could look like when rooted in integrity and community. Malcolm's name was no longer simply associated with the man who had dismantled Langston, but with a vision for what could replace it. The initiatives expanded financial literacy programs in public schools, investment in small business incubators, partnerships with local credit unions to extend fair access to capital. Meanwhile, Langston Bancorp's remnants were quietly absorbed by competitors, its name erased from office towers and legal documents. But Malcolm was not interested in gloating. He didn't need to. The real victory, he believed, lay not in watching a corrupt system crumble, but in proving that a better one could be built. He often thought back to the morning he had been led from the bank's lobby, the weight of humiliation pressing against his spine, the sting of quiet exclusion searing into his memory. And he thought, too, of the moment the financial world realized that the man they had dismissed was in fact their equal. No, they're better, not because of wealth or power, but because of principle and vision. In his private reflections, Malcolm sometimes wondered what Langston's executives thought as they watched the rise of Reed Financial's initiatives. Did they regret their choices? Did they see too late the possibilities they had dismissed in favor of preserving their insular world? He would never know. And it no longer mattered. As spring warmed the city, Reed Financial hosted its first community summit, a gathering not in a towering boardroom, but in a renovated public library in Bronzeville. Community leaders, educators, small business owners, and students filled the space, their voices rising in discussion, their ideas mingling and sparking. Malcolm stood at the back of the room, listening not as a figurehead, but as a participant in a movement larger than himself. In that moment, he understood that the work of dismantling barriers was never truly finished, that the real power lay in the quiet, steady labor of building something better together. He smiled as he heard a young woman, perhaps no older than his own niece, describe her plans to launch a financial literacy podcast aimed at teenagers. He watched as Evan and Clara exchanged ideas with local activists about creating accessible loan programs. And he felt for the first time in months a lightness in his chest. Not relief, but hope. Because in the end, Malcolm knew that the most enduring triumph wasn't in tearing down walls. It was in building bridges strong enough to carry everyone forward. Malcolm Reed's journey was one that transcended personal victory and reached into the very heart of systemic injustice. From the moment he stepped into Langston Bancorp, a quiet man in an unassuming suit, he carried with him not just a portfolio of wealth, but a quiet resolve. What unfolded was a story of humiliation met with resilience, of silent fortitude in the face of overt disrespect, and ultimately of a reclamation of dignity, not through confrontation, but through the unwavering force of truth. His initial expulsion from the bank wasn't merely an isolated act of prejudice. It was emblematic of deeper societal biases that assume worth can be measured by appearance or by preconceived notions of power. When the truth of Malcolm's identity was unveiled, that he was not merely a client, but a key stakeholder whose deposits underpinned billions in Langston's assets, the collapse was swift and undeniable. But Malcolm's true victory wasn't found in Langston's downfall. It was in his response, in his refusal to be defined by the pettiness and prejudice that had sought to dismiss him. Rather than revel in retribution, he redirected his energy into building something new, an inclusive, community-oriented financial ecosystem that prioritized transparency, equity, and opportunity. His story is a powerful reminder that real change doesn't begin with the exposure of injustice alone. It begins with what we choose to do after the curtain has been pulled back. Malcolm didn't just highlight a problem, he modeled a solution. He showed that leadership isn't about standing atop a crumbling system, but about using one's position and resources to create pathways for others. His commitment to rebuilding, to lifting as he climbed, transformed what could have been a tale of bitterness into one of profound inspiration. For each of us, the lesson is clear. We may not all possess the resources Malcolm did, but we each have the power to challenge injustice where we find it. It starts with refusing to be silent, with choosing to listen to those who are marginalized, and with using whatever influence we have, no matter how small, to create spaces of fairness and respect. Whether in the workplace, in our communities, or in our personal lives, we can choose to be builders of bridges, rather than protectors of walls. So, as we reflect on Malcolm Reed's journey, let it be a catalyst for our own. Let it inspire us to ask, what walls am I willing to challenge? Whose voices am I willing to amplify? And how can I contribute to creating a world where respect is not a privilege, but a fundamental right? If this story resonated with you, if it sparked reflection or stirred your sense of justice, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels our mission to bring forward more stories that uplift, challenge, and inspire. Stay tuned for more narratives that shine a light on courage, resilience, and the quiet power of doing what's right. Join us on this journey of storytelling that not only informs, but transforms. Subscribe now and help us continue to make a difference.